This is Cybersound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity, with your hosts, Jason Pufahl and Stephen Maresca.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Cybersound. I'm your host, Jason Pufahl. Joining me today, as always, Steve Maresca and Matt Fusaro. Hey, guys.
Hey there.
Hi.
So we're going to kind of roll back a little bit with some cyber liability insurance discussion. In particular, we're seeing our clients come to us now with more stringent requirements for policy renewals in some cases, or even new policies, right? And I think, last year we touched a little bit on the fact that insurance carriers were, frankly, kind of bemoaning the fact that they had really not adequately planned for the severity of ransomware. And I think, their costs are higher, and as you would expect, right? Costs and sort of some requirements changes are being passed down to clients. So I think I wanted to cover that a little bit today, because I think it's important for people to be able to plan for the upcoming year, right? A lot of policies we're seeing are probably coming due for renewal in that June, July timeframe. The control requirements are becoming much more stringent than they were, and I think the landscape's changing to some degree. So we wanted to cover that a little bit so people could prepare for the upcoming year. In particular, I think we're seeing certain industries even being less attractive to some degree to these carriers, right? I think Steve, you were chatting about that a little bit here at the beginning, around maybe higher ed, even due to the way it's open being a challenge.
Right. I think insurers in general are reevaluating the risk of certain verticals and treating them appropriately. Higher ed's sort of a case in point that's a little unique. It's open. It's not corporate. Things are not locked down. Therefore, it represents a higher risk. But there are certainly carriers for every organization. They still exist. It's just a matter of recognizing that things are changing from the way they used to be. The biggest thing that most of our customers tend to observe is that the carrier insurance prices are going up. Premiums are 300-400% higher than they used to be.
Yeah.
It's the most apparent issue. But, I think all the other subjects we'd like to talk about today are what is coupled with that change in price.
Yeah. I mean, they're definitely looking to claw back some of the, maybe the losses they've taken. They had a pretty toxic pool of clients out there that probably drained them, right? They don't think they were prepared at all for how unprepared a lot of these organizations were for any type of cyber attack. And they've just gotten worse, right? And more prevalent.
And as you'd expect, we're seeing a shift in conversations with people as they're trying to reinsure themselves and find new policies, control their costs. And, the truth is that it's moving the other direction.
Yeah,
right.
There's no surprise here, right? I mean, we're seeing these common controls that we're going to talk about as being real gaps. Every time that we've done incident response, it's a really consistent theme on the sort of the back end of these around what controls we're missing, and it's almost always the same ones: poor backups, lack of two-factor, lack of patching, and we're really seeing a push now to standardize and formalize a more mature security approach, and that's really all this is, right? On the one hand, sure, premiums are going up and they're being a little more stringent. Everything on this list is reasonable, right? Everything on this list are things that people should be doing.
I think the most interesting thing is that carriers are taking a far more active role in ensuring that their risk and the risk of their experienced by their customers is more controllable. Historically, you sign up for a policy, it gets inked, you're done. That's it. Now requirements are being imposed that prior to the policy origination date, certain minimum thresholds need to be met. Now, the most common, because the attacks we've seen and they've paid to correct over the last 2 years, have been primarily driven by identity theft,
right?
Primarily driven by loss of credentials that allowed access to environments. So top of the list is multi-factor or two-factor authentication. That's an absolute requirement for most of these insurers.
So dig into that for a second, though, right? Because two-factor means different things to different people,
it does.
And they're being pretty specific about where two-factor needs to be enabled.
Right, and generally speaking, it's for VPN access, remote access to environments. But more generally, that's not descriptive of every organization these days. The other requirement is applying multi-factor to email and similar services of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, there's some carriers that want it on every externally accessible service. You need to have it on, and then even internally now they're asking for it, especially if you're an admin.
Right. People with access to sensitive information, customer information, regulated data, those are the scenarios beyond mere remote access where multi-factor is likely to arise. But that might be a case-by-case scenario depending upon the type of business.
Yeah, I think it'll have a big impact anyway. And I'd say almost 100% of our incidents were with clients that had no multi-factor implementation. I'm not sure if I can even name one of them.
Yeah, I agree.
overly permissive external access and no two-factor. Right? I mean, it's just a common theme.
Right. I mean, it's a net improvement to make many of these requirements. I think it's reasonable. We make these suggestions constantly with our customers, and I see that overall, this is a net positive. It's just costly for those who are experiencing the need to renew a policy.
Sure. So certainly, MFA being one. I think the other is more stringent controls and requirements for robust backups. Right? I mean, a huge issue has been the lack of disaster recovery planning, good backup capabilities. Right, and I think they're mandating now certain time frames for which you need to keep data and the way you actually control it.
Yeah, I mean, even more critical than that, simply having offsite backups,
right?
Encrypted backups, a backup for the backup, essentially. Ransomware incidents involve attacks against backup infrastructure, and I think that's the primary thing that they're trying to control. The business restoration, factors into many cyber liability insurance policies. It's a covered component. Therefore, the timeframes that we're talking about from a restoration standpoint from backup infrastructure, that's what they're trying to, facilitate in terms of lowering the cost for recovery activity.
Right, and all these recommendations really are looking to reduce that, right? The time it takes and the amount of money that they're going to have to eventually cover for an incident.
Yeah, and they've got data now. They know that typically when you're restoring, you're probably going back around a month for some of the data.
Yep.
And how often do we get involved in an incident where either A, the backups weren't adequately tested, so they don't even know if they have good quality data, or B, they've got 7 days to go back, and that isn't far enough to get outside of that ransomware event or incident event that they're occurring.
Yeah, and if they're going to go down the forensics route, where if they have to decide if credit monitoring or data disclosure has to happen, they want to be able to go back into logs of systems that may go back further, right? So having those backups available helps you with that.
Absolutely. An interesting component to this beyond backup is that carriers are trying to measure risk as well. And I think it's sort of the other end of what you just articulated in terms of notification. Ultimately, prior to policy origination, prior to the actual conversation moving into the contract creation phase, some insurers are actually proactively scanning customers before issuing that policy. So they have a sense of external exposure to the world so that they can make requirements that are very unambiguous and clear to those prospective customers. I think it's a very, very unique change and worthy of being mentioned because I don't think many organizations are aware of it.
So I like the word unambiguous. I think unambiguous to you, but probably ambiguous to the recipient at times, right? Because I know that we had one where, if I recall, the recommendation was reset your Kerberos ticket for Active Directory. And I think that might make a lot of sense to you. I think people require you to translate to them, perhaps.
Unambiguous to organizations with IT actually on staff, right?
But very specific nonetheless, right? I mean, doing a scan and identifying a gap that they know will contribute to an incident if not addressed. So,
absolutely.
I think the other place that they're really now pushing is EDR, endpoint detection and response, or MDR, the sort of the managed side of that. Modern day antivirus. Huge changes there.
And I think that translates to changes from a budgetary perspective. This is one of those occasions where, in order to meet the insurer requirements, you, as an organization, may need to replace something that's already present. Traditional antivirus does not meet the threshold of an EDR. endpoint detection and response. It effectively, insurers want to see these protective facilities in place across workstations and servers where they tend to be absent. And the thresholds are, 95% of systems, 100% of systems. We've seen a variety, but the point is ultimately comprehensive defensive facilities in place. And that might mean shifting from something that's been in place for a decade.
Right. I think they're really going after the behavior detection, right? Most of the malware that we see now, you might get a detection from a traditional AV. They're more concerned about attacker behavior, trying to detect those things, possibly even having data to go back to look and see what systems they've touched, right? Because that's going to play into how that policy actually gets covered or not. And again, moving data out of the organization, which is something they're going to be concerned about. If an EDR isn't there, you're not going to get that kind of data or detections.
Right. This actually goes back to multi-factor, candidly. Again, stressing the point that identity is the mechanism for most attacks these days.
Yep.
Similarly, use of authorized capabilities of a user stolen by an attacker is only really easy to detect, easy to analyze if you have a tool like EDR platforms in place.
Yeah, that's the key there, right? Most of the activities that are going to happen that are going to affect an organization are authorized activity, right? Copying a file out, that's something we allow most users to do, right?
The word that you used a second ago was demonstrable, right? 95 to 100% deployment for these tools, but they want you to be able to show evidence that you actually have done it. So it's not enough to say, well, I purchased a binary defense and deployed it. Like, you need to show that you actually deployed that to servers and endpoints and have adequate coverage. And they want that proof if they're going to honor a claim.
Absolutely, and frankly, you're talking about demonstrable proof, attestation of actual practice. It's a reasonable segue into one of the other requirements, which is the fact that they want to see rigorous process and evidence that that process is documented and being followed on a regular basis. An example, as a case in point, would be vulnerability management practices, measuring risk on a cyclical basis, fixing issues with corrective actions to either patch or remove an issue from the environment. If an organization can't point to an actual process and documentation that it's occurring, it's also another black mark.
Yeah, I'd like to talk for a second about how difficult this might be for some organizations. There wasn't really a lot of notification that went out about this.
Oh, yeah,
right?
I mean, honestly, almost none.
Yeah. It's a surprise at the renewal time frame. It comes out of the business office. No one really knew that type of thing was a requirement, and
exactly.
IT departments are scrambling to catch up.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at compliances for government, for example, this stuff is communicated way in advance and sometimes doesn't even come to fruition, right? This kind of came out of nowhere. I think a lot of people are caught off guard completely that they've got to do these things, and they're not really given a huge time frame to actually accomplish any of this either. Depending on the size of your organization, it might be simple to say, well, let's deploy EDR and multi-factor, right? You might be looking at months worth of work to actually get that accomplished. You're talking about culture changes. So this is going to be very challenging for a lot of organizations to actually meet.
And the requirements, they're not consistent for every insurance carrier, right? So it's not like you can say, all right, do these 4 things. We can't sit here on this podcast and say, do these 4 things, and when renewal time comes up, you're set, because they are variable to some degree, and carrier by carrier, there's sort of differences and gaps in what they want.
Yeah, there is no standard they're going by. I mean, from what we've seen, they've actually taken recommendations in from third-party companies and then adopted that framework and said, okay, this is what we're going to go with.
Right.
But
in a large part, if organizations decided to adopt some sort of security standard, all of these do align to your typical security standard framework. So, at the barest minimum, of the most basic here, you are seeing this sort of underlying, here are common controls that you need to implement, sort of that security fundamentals concept that make your security program more robust and reduce the risk of incidents. And whether it's simply doing what the insurance carriers tell you, or maybe aligning to a more specific standard like NIST 800-171 or something like that, you're going to then have a better security program which reduces risk, because it's ultimately what they're trying to do.
And certainly we support that as an outcome. I think that it's worthy of it's a required recognition that this type of activity requires time. It's probably occurring on a time frame which is more aggressive than organizations would prefer, and the capital outlay is not insignificant for many orgs, associated with the staffing and service requirements to actually deploy these things and support them properly.
Yeah, these requirements are coming down on companies that have no IT sometimes.
Right.
Right. They've either outsourced it or they've got a guy. Right.
Right. We've joked in the past a little bit about people treating a insurance policy as a substitute for a good security program.
Right.
And I think the carriers are finally saying, listen, that's no longer acceptable. You need to meet some minimum security standards. I'm staring at 3 pages worth of notes here from one client of ours and their insurance carrier saying, these are the things you want to implement. So we truly talked about those things on the page marked high. There's a medium risk page, a low risk page. There's a lot of requirements that people have to start thinking about with this. And, I guess I would ask people, use this podcast essentially as being put on notice that you probably have some increased requirements moving forward. Those requirements, quite frankly, from our standpoint, are kind of all security best practices. They're things we would want to see in place anyway. And most significant contributors to the incidents that we've been involved in, without a doubt. To touch on them briefly, it's implementing multi-factor in a variety of locations. It's utilizing an EDR system, right, to that next generation of antivirus, ensuring that you've got good quality backups, and of course making sure, as always, that you're dealing with patches and vulnerability management. I mean, there are things you should be doing, but and if you're not, they're likely going to limit your ability to get a policy, either a new one or a renewal. But I think people also have to understand, going forward, insurance is going to be more expensive, and in order to actually make a claim and have that claim honored, you're going to have to meet some of these things. I think as a follow-up, as you're going through this process, feel free to reach out to us if you want to chat about this anymore. We can provide probably a lot of clarity on different ways clients have implemented some of these controls, different things you need to think about as you're working through a project, and how to actually make them sort of go as smoothly as you can. Multi-factor isn't a wildly difficult technical concept, but requires planning and time to roll it out successfully. So we're happy to have those conversations. Feel free to reach out to us on Twitter or LinkedIn at Vancord or Vancord Security, and we can chat more about it. Steve, it looks like in closing you might have something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that when you're working with insurers and carriers and underwriters, it's a conversation.
Right.
Use a broker. They will help you find a carrier that meets your business and the flexibility required. Similarly, look for those that reach out and have a dialogue with you. When you're engaging an insurer, they should supply a questionnaire or something to that effect. It's a bi-directional conversation, and that will enable the best possible premium and the most attuned policy that meets the needs of the organization. I think that's the most important thing to close with, in my opinion.
So actually, I'm going to add to that just really quickly, which is find a carrier that's flexible enough to let you use a security vendor that you're comfortable with. We've certainly seen a lot of carriers require that you go with people who are on their panels. And in some cases, that's fine. But the reality is you may have a security vendor that you work with regularly who's familiar with your environment, frankly, can probably expedite the recovery or the containment, the restoration, and all the activities around incident response. Work ahead of time with your carrier to ensure that you can work with the partner of your choice. Some are much easier to work with than others, but I think that's something, to your point, Steve. With all insurance, just flexibility up front to negotiate how you want that insurance to work. Give thought to that. And again, we've got experience there and happy to chat with people about it. So, well, on that, as always, we hope you got value from this. We hope that you're thinking a little bit about cyber liability insurance in general, and certainly preparing for that renewal process and some of the requirements that you have ongoing. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day.
Stay vigilant. Stay resilient. This has been Cybersound.